Thank you for joining me today for the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation's Holocaust Education Center podcast series. I am joined today by Dr. Michael LeRoy, the Alumni Professor of Labor and Employment Relations and affiliated faculty of the College of Law at the University of Illinois. He is a dedicated member of the local Jewish community and the son of a Holocaust survivor. Thank you so much for joining me today, Michael.
Thank you for having me, Elizabeth.
Before we get into your father's story, I want to hear a little bit about you. I don't even know where you grew up, where you attended school, and what brought you to Champaign.
That's a complicated story. My father and mother were married about 10 months before I was born. I grew up for the first 4 or 5 years of my life in Skokie, Illinois, which is a predominantly Jewish community, or was when I was a kid. My parents were divorced. It was traumatic for everybody. After my father remarried, I then moved to a small horse farm near Barrington and Elgin. And I grew up there, and those were my most formative years, I would say. And how did I get to Illinois? Well, long story short is I really wanted to go to Northwestern in the worst way. I was accepted, and there was a Shabbat dinner where I had an acceptance from Illinois. And it was on this crude printout with, the tractor holes, and it said, "You have been admitted," highly bureaucratic. Northwestern had sent this parchment-like letter. It was not a good conversation. My dad wanted me to go to Northwestern. Nothing was too good for his son. My mom was very pragmatic and said, "Illinois is a perfectly fine place and much less expensive. I think Michael's going to go there." And my mom won. I went to Illinois, and I was miserable for the first year, and I wanted to transfer. But then I met my future wife, and things changed. And so here I am. They can't get rid of me.
Now let's delve into your family's history. Your father, Otto Lefkowitz, was born in Hungary. In 1944, he and his entire family were deported to Auschwitz, where most of them did not survive. Please tell me what his childhood was like prior to that.
My father did not talk at all. This is typical of Holocaust survivors. He did not talk at all about the Holocaust for the first 12 years of my life. There was ironically, a professor at Northwestern University. His last name was Butz, B-U-T-Z. But he was an engineering professor who put out a Holocaust denial book. He published this book. And my father was enraged. He changed from being silent to being extremely vocal and active. Now, so it was in that vein that I learned about my father's childhood. But to make a long story short, my father frames this account in the following terms. He and his family could find headstones in the Jewish cemetery going back from the 1930s, 350 years prior, which is stunning to think about. This Jewish family, they had experienced pogroms, but they mostly experienced a good community. And my father grew up in this good community. My father's father, my grandfather Herman, was a horse merchant. And so he would be the equivalent today of your local BMW dealer. And by that, I mean his clientele included the gentry class of the region. And interestingly, a significant portion of the Catholic leadership, which had a lot of money. While my grandfather was a very observant Jew, he was an assimilated Jew in the sense that when he left home, he interacted freely and successfully with Gentiles. And so my father learned at an early age to be respectful of people outside the Jewish community. Tip your hat when you go by the Catholic Church as a sign of respect. My father's best friend when he was growing up was not a Jewish boy or girl, but it was a next door neighbor, a Catholic boy, and they played soccer until the day before my father's family was told that they would be resettled in Kishvarda. They had a tearful goodbye. So my dad had this upbringing for the first 10 or 11 years of his life, very normal, sounded a lot like an American upbringing. He would go to the movies on the weekend, and the movies would have a newsreel. So instead of having trailers, this is how you got your visual presentation of news. And he would see Hitler, who was literally a foreign character, but also a threatening character. Now, my father's father, Herman, married a Jewish woman who was the daughter of the chief rabbi of Berlin. This is an interesting contrast. On my grandfather's side, there was a very traditional sense of Jewish observance. It was just short of what we would call Orthodox, and the boundary of conservative and Orthodox. Herman married a college-educated woman, University of Berlin, daughter of one of the leaders of the German Jewish Reform movement. And it was not a match made in heaven, but it was a match made on earth. So it was in that environment. So now to thread back here. So my father grew up with a German mother and a Hungarian father. So he had some German. And so he could understand what Hitler was saying. And he could understand that Hitler was talking about Jews and threatening Jews. And so my father entered into a series of inquiries or questions about questions we're asking today with the rise of virulent anti-Semitism, which is how concerned should we be for our safety? And to make a long story short, the answer he always got was one of reassurance and pointing to 350 years of a family history of weathering tough storms in Nirmata. So there was a rational basis for this. Now, my father's family really has two elements. Herman had 5 children by his first wife, and his first wife died in childbirth, which caused Herman to be, I'm surmising this, I was never told this, in the market for a wife and a mother. And so I think that's what set up this unusual arranged marriage. But in any event, the messaging that my father received was reassurance. Against those reassurances, he and his family experienced boycotting in terms of they went to stores that had threatening signs aimed at Jews specifically. Eventually, my grandfather's business was subject to a limited and then expanding boycott, really stressed the family financially. My father, coming back from Hebrew school on a late afternoon when the sun was setting, was surrounded by 3 unknown teenagers who just beat him up and spat on him and called him a dirty Jew. And so along the way, my father would say that the answers remained the same, but seemed less convincing to him. That's a quick summary of his childhood. I should add one more element. He experienced discrimination in schools. There was a public education system in Hungary, but once Hungary fell under a Nazi puppet government, they adopted in increments Nazi laws, including numerous clauses, which had among its provisions increasing quotas on how many Jews could attend school.
So this was up until you're talking, he was about 11 at this point.
Yeah, he managed to get into high school. And then there was a conversation about should the family move to Budapest. At least he had an aunt in Budapest. I think her name was Julia. It just accelerated from the time that he was about 11 to about 16 or 17. It was just a descent into the abyss.
At what age were he and his family rounded up, and how exactly did that happen?
Believe it or not, it came as a surprise to them. You know, hindsight's 2020. You look at this and you would say, reverting to his older half siblings, I don't like to use that term. What happened was several of them came to America. They were old enough, they were frightened, and they got out. And they were able to. The rest of the family stayed back, including 5 children from the second marriage. And my dad was the oldest. In any event, there was a pounding at the door one evening, right around Passover of 1944. There was a stormtrooper behind a policeman, and they were told that their community was no longer safe for Jews. This really speaks to misinformation or disinformation and lies, that Jews were going to be resettled to protect them, to protect their safety. I mean, just imagine being uprooted from your home, but imagine more being uprooted from a home where your family has lived for 350 years. I cannot imagine that. And when I give talks to kids in school about the Holocaust, I routinely ask, how many of you have moved at least once in your life? And about 98% of the hands go up. And then I relate to kids that, well, my father's family never moved for 350 years. That's older than the United States of America. Of course, it's hard to think about that, but I try to draw that.
It's hard to conceptualize when you're little, but that's a good perspective. They had no notice, and they were told they were being, I'm using air quotes, resettled. They didn't know what that meant at the time.
No, but let's put it this way. My dad eventually related a story where at a Shabbos service on a Friday night, and then let's peg the year 42 or 43, there was a speaker, to use air quotes, who showed up. and was given an audience. He could not speak Hungarian. He spoke Polish, and he was disfigured. He was badly scarred. And he related to the congregation that he had been left for dead in a pit in the concentration camp that was set afire. And he had scars from serious burns to show for it. And he warned the community, get out while you can. Now, can you imagine that? I can't. My family did not move. And by the way, I don't think they could have moved by that time. I just don't. It goes to your question of what was this like? I don't think anybody thought for sure that they were going to be safe. I think the most poignant story from that 24-hour period of notice to removal involved my then 8-year-old aunt, Gabi or Gabriella, and my father's younger sister. She was a walking poster child for how cruel and ironic the German stereotype of an Aryan beauty, what Aryan beauty was about. She was blonde. She had straight hair. She had deep blue eyes, fair skin. She could have passed for Aryan or German or Nazi, but she had flowing long hair. She had never had a haircut per se. And her mother, Reggie, washed her hair, sat her on a stool, and explained to Gabi that I need to cut your hair. Wherever we go, we won't be able to wash ourselves as frequently. And so Gabi was in tears. I mean, and what girl wouldn't be in tears, or what boy wouldn't be in tears if they haven't cut their hair? They're used to long hair. My grandmother then braided the hair and put it in the family chest. And to me, that signified hope that they would get through. But they didn't. But that, I think, reflects the mindset. Just like in America today, there are segregated patterns of housing, and it was very common. It was prevalent in Nirmatas. When my family walked out the door, they saw other Jewish families with a trunk leaving, and they were marched 2 miles out of town. My dad looked back and saw that his neighbor's blinds were closed. My dad surmises the blinds were closed under threat from the police and also to prevent testimony about what had happened. They were marched 2 miles out of town and put on a waiting boxcar in a long line of boxcars that went on to Kishvarda. And then they were in a resettlement camp for about 6 weeks, and then they were loaded out to Auschwitz.
How many members of your extended family were sent out there?
26 members died either in Auschwitz or there were a couple of other death camps. My uncle Paul, who was part of that first cohort, but he had stayed back, my father later found out, was used as a human shield in what is now Ukraine, advancing in front of Nazi tanks meeting artillery from the Russians. So we lost 26 family members. Again, my dad's family had 10 children. I think 3 had made it to America. And so if you do some simple math, the survivors were Margaret from the older cohort, Robert, my father, George, his younger brother, and Steve, his youngest brother. So 4 survivors. The kids who died that I know of were Paul or Polly, Gabi, the 8-year-old girl, and my namesake, Mickey or Miklos, who was 10 or 11 years old.
And your father and 2 of his brothers, George and Steve, were taken to a different camp. Do you think that's what attributed to them not perishing?
Yes. And the reason that they were sent to another camp is because they were capable of providing labor. It was forced labor. It's hard to come up with a terminology for it. It's not slavery, not chattel slavery. They're not owned. And it's not convict labor. It's just forced labor under the most extreme circumstances. So this camp, at the time, it was in the far western edge of Poland, in an area that was trading off between Germany and Poland. But that's where he and his brothers lived, worked, survived from roughly early June until their liberation, February 11th, 1945.
Did you go on to have a relationship with your uncles?
A very strong relationship with them. My father felt that he was put in a father figure role to protect them, especially for Steve. Steve was the baby, and he was 14, and George was 2 years younger. So my dad, just to show you how this worked, My dad became a proficient thief in stealing food from garbage and from supply trucks, and he was good. He got away with it. But one day he did not get away with it. It's a really sad story because, in part, he was ratted out by his capo, and his capo was a Jewish man who turned in my father for some cigarettes and chocolate. When that happened, my father had his nose broken hard, and he was put in what I would call a pill box. So he was put in a box where for 3 days he had no food, no water. His brothers managed to get out and in the early hours of the morning and give him something to survive with. They helped each other survive, is the long story short.
How do you talk about the atrocities that your own father endured? How do you bring yourself to be able to talk about this?
I mean, at the moment, I'm settled because you are a friend and I understand the purpose here. But I have to say, Elizabeth, and Janet would verify this, every time I speak at a school, which I will never say no, but I dread it. And when I finish in tears or close to tears, it just hangs over me. And in telling his story, it's just a flood of emotions. One emotion is now that I'm a parent and a grandparent, I think of what this had to be like to see little children subjected to the worst cruelty that humankind can render. Who knows? We may finish this, then I'll not feel so good. And I don't think I have a choice. I've got to do it. And then when I really feel down, I just remind myself that I'm not living it. I'm just relating it. And it's nothing like that. But I have to say, Elizabeth, when I was a freshman at the University of Illinois, I did an honors project that greatly unsettled me. So we've got great research resources here. And in the stacks, I was able to find diplomatic cables from sources in Europe that were reporting early in the 1940s the existence of concentration camps and urging bombing of the rail lines going into them. And there were no replies to the cables, but there was clear evidence that the American Foreign Service understood what was going on and communicated a very strong humanitarian concern. And I don't have the terminology. I don't know what I experienced, but as a freshman, I just felt that I couldn't escape what I was reading, that it suffocated me. And, I talked to my father about it, and he said, finish what you're doing because it's important. And then he said, then just let go of it. He said, you just can't hurt yourself over it.
What incredible advice from an amazingly strong man. Let's take a breath. Let's talk about February 11th, 1945. They were liberated. Building up to that, they had no idea what the outside world knew, if they were ever going to leave this existence. Can you tell me a little bit about how they got liberated and what happened in the immediate aftermath?
I can tell you a lot, but not everything. But here's what was related to me. About 2 to 3 weeks before February 11th, the food rations improved. And then my father could hear artillery fire to the east and to the west. And they understood that they were in the path of the Russian army advancing from the east and the Allies advancing from the west. And their guards all of a sudden became much nicer, obviously because they were concerned that there would be some justice meted out to them. Well, it turned out that the Russians liberated the camp. And here's where the story gets fuzzy and really disturbing. When the camp was liberated, the Russians stood back and they told the prisoners, apparently the German guards were detained. And so there was vigilante justice meted out to the guards. And my dad never got specific about it, but it had to be horrifying. And I think without knowing exactly, I think it's an illustration of man's inhumanity against man and how powerful the motive for retribution is. I don't know if it's instinctive or I don't know how we get it, but I can't judge that. I just want to circle back before I lose the thought. The two things I want to say. My dad would tell me that every night at sunset or every evening, he would say the Shema, and he would pray that he would live to see the sun rise. And every morning when the sun rose, he would say then set. And I think that's how he got through. Having said that, when you hear my father and read his memoirs, because he narrated this and I've got it in written form, he was deeply alienated from God. He had a relationship from God from the time he was taken from his home, but it was a bad relationship. And he says in not grammatical English, but in powerful terms, he says in his memoirs, me and God, we separated ways at Auschwitz. He kept praying and he kept talking to God, and he would relate how angry he was with God. We have nothing like that today, but we have hints of that today. And there are members of our own community who are deeply concerned about, what's happening in the Middle East. And are we playing a role in this or not as Jewish people? And I don't want to wade into that, except to say, from my father's perspective, he would tell you that he did not believe in God, that he was angry at God, but his behaviors belied that. He did. He would say, my birth and my bris was the moment when he was willing to move himself on a path to make a new relationship with God. It was not like flipping a switch, but it was a recognition that there was an opportunity for a new generation.
We were talking about his liberation. How did he go from a camp overseas to ending up in Skokie, Illinois?
It was not an immediate path. Let me frame this by saying my father died when I was 48. So we had 48 years together. And we had a very, very close relationship, not without its battles, so to speak, but a very intense, loving relationship. So my father died in 2005, and then my mother died in 2014, Carol. At some point, we all knew she was terminally ill, and I would visit her once a week in the Chicago area, partly just to talk and partly just to try to pretend things were normal when they weren't, and partly to plan for the eventuality of her passing and so forth. And then there was a meeting I had, a lunch meeting, and I had just developed a course here at the university called Immigration and Employment Policy. A lot of immigration courses are either taught from a sociological perspective or legally. It's taught from sort of asylum, and sort of the main buckets are not employment. And I'm an employment lawyer, so I'm interested in that. She said, I want to tell you something that's going to come as a surprise to you. I said, all right. She said, your dad never came here legally. What do you mean? And so she related this story. She didn't know this. When she married my father, this was never disclosed. She knew about his background. To make a long story short, 25, 30 years later, my father was retiring. And so she started to press him to apply for Social Security benefits because he paid into it. He just put her off, which husbands are wont to do. But there was a time when my mother said, why aren't you doing this? And my father got defensive. And he said, don't ask. And my mom said, I'm going to ask, why aren't you doing this? And he said, because I am not the man the United States government thinks I am. I don't want to be deported. He came here with false papers completely. There was a quota on Jewish refugees, 20,000 a year in the year that he came here, 1949. He was beyond quota and beyond the age limit. He came here with papers that indicated he had a French last name, LeRoy. You asked me in preparation for this, how did your father get his first name? I never thought about that.
He started out as Otto, and then you referenced him as Robert. Is there a link there?
Let me just also say, he was not born as Otto Lefkowitz either. So we go back to his mother, who was a German, college-educated city girl, as my father would say. My grandfather, who was a Hungarian nationalist cavalry horse merchant. They're very different people. My grandfather insisted that my father be named Zoltan, which is a common Hungarian name, and it basically means sultan or ruler. If you found a birth certificate for him, if one existed in Budapest where he was born, you would see Zoltan Otto Lefkowitz. But my grandmother put her foot down and said, you will never call him Zoltan. He is Otto, a German name.
So he came here and Americanized his name, for lack of a better word.
And he did it consciously. What he would tell us, he told us half the truth. He said he wanted to have children and he did not want them to be identified as Jews. And so he said, I'm not going to have a Jewish name. I'm not going to have a Jewish last name. I'm not going to have a Jewish first name. And my kids, Michael, Steve, and Catherine, they're not going to be whatever your conception is of a Jewish name. I have to say, this comes in a sketchy way to me. And my father's passage was made possible, I am told, by a large donation made by an NBA basketball player. I've sort of backtracked and looked this up. I don't know who it was, but I think it was Dolph Shays, who was an all-star basketball player, and it doesn't matter where, I think out of NYU, but he was very successful, whether it was Shays or somebody else. There was a basketball player providing money for Jewish settlement. And I would add, as I've tried to fill in, and I don't know, but I'm surmising this, under political pressure in the 1943, 1944, FDR finally did something about the Holocaust, and he set up something called the War Refugee Board. And the War Refugee Board was a rogue entity, in at least this sense. They would funnel money to operatives throughout Europe to bring Jews to America. So this was not with an American face. This was proxies for the American government. Now, my father, just before he had come to America, when he returned to his home had been possessed by the communists who had taken over. Remember, Russia had prevailed. He lost his home. He was dispossessed. And so he became a horse thief or a horse trader. Depends on how you want to look at it. But he ran horses, high quality horses between Romania and Hungary, back and forth. And he made a pretty good living, he said, until he was captured and put in a Romanian jail. I think he bribed his way out. I also think he trafficked in jewels and gems, but I think he had money. And I think he was able to get to elements of the Haganah. The reason I think it's the Haganah is they gave him a choice between going to Israel or the United States. And since he already had family in the United States, he came here. So there was some sort of Haganah connection and remnants of the French underground. But he shipped out of Bremenhaven, Germany in late February of 1949. Like many immigrants coming into New York, he sailed past the Statue of Liberty. He understood what he was seeing, and he was overcome with emotion, and he started out.
Earlier, you alluded to the fact that your father wasn't very observant until this book was written, this anti-Semitic book. And then suddenly, flash forward, he founded Witnesses to the Holocaust. He also helped develop and implement the mandatory teaching of the Holocaust in Illinois public schools. Do you remember that switch in your father of him becoming the person that wanted to educate the future so this doesn't happen again? Or did this happen before you existed?
Oh, no, it happened when I was about 11 or 12. And so it would be an impressionable age where I was getting ready for my bar mitzvah. I certainly was going to Hebrew school, much to my displeasure, but I was doing it. Glad I did in hindsight. But let me just say, Elizabeth, and this is a little difficult to listen to, I would wake up every morning listening to my father throwing up. He was plagued by nightmares. He was a tortured soul. You could never get used to listening to a person throw up every morning. By the time he came out to greet us at the breakfast table, he was composed, he had brushed his teeth, he had showered, he was normal. I knew something wasn't right. And I also knew that every time we were stopped for a freight train, my father would turn off the car, light a cigarette, get out of the car, and face away. I can't say it was a shock because I knew in general terms he had survived the Holocaust. The specifics we never, ever got into. But once this book came out, my father went from silent to, it was like 0 to 60 in a second. And I want to share what I think is a nice story. He set aside his business, whatever. He was determined to speak to children. His obituary, the Trib did a wonderful obituary. And the obituary relayed that my father's mission was to educate children about the Holocaust. And it quoted my father for saying, children can be taught not to hate. That was my dad's mission. I will teach you not to hate, which is a profound goal and sorely needed today. So he just dove into it. So it was kind of a whiplash thing for me, because all of a sudden, I do remember, and I'm not proud to say it, I would be seated for very lengthy and painful conversations that I did not want to hear.
No child wants to absorb that, knowing what their parents endured.
There's that for sure. And there's also being 12 or 13 and just like, I don't want to listen to my parents, really. It's a compound effect.
At this point, when I'm talking to the children of Holocaust survivors, I ask about idiosyncrasies that they noticed in their parents. Your father threw up every morning. He got out of a car at a passing train and smoked a cigarette and had to turn his back. How would you say this has affected you personally? Has this changed any of your habits because you do know this about your history?
Well, thankfully, I don't have those issues. I don't know if I can separate out my anxiety in the Trump era from your anxiety. I doubt it. Just to say, I dismissed my father's prophecy that America had every capability of becoming deeply anti-Semitic. I was idealistic. I was just at the tail end of the Vietnam War protest movement, but there was an air of idealism and the flower power kind of thing. And I wanted to hear optimism, not pessimism. How has it affected me? I would just say that's a hard question to answer. We have approached teaching the Holocaust with our kids in what we hope is a balanced way, which is measured. And I'm going to make a strange comparison, but the strange comparison I would make would be, I would not want to teach my kids about the facts of life without having a book to keep me sort of at the right level of disclosure and the right level of the tone. And Janet really gets the lion's share of credit for educating our kids. It's a balancing act that everybody should be thinking about, which is provide information, but understand its devastating power and err on the side of less disclosure. Always teach your kids that this is inherently painful and potentially damaging. Be conscious of your limits and don't be guilty about pushing out of it.
In the 48 years you had with your father, did you ever see him truly relax and experience legitimate joy?
No. What a marvelous, insightful question. No. As my mom would relate, because she was in that bathroom and she was in that bedroom, and she would relate in my father's obituary, not a day went by when my father didn't cry for his lost family. If you wake up growing up every morning and crying for your lost family, it speaks to your intuition that every event had a shadow, even the best events, even a bar mitzvah, a wedding. And it showed in my father's demeanor. He had a sense of humor, for sure, and he could have fun. He did, and he loved being with his family. But you always had the sense that part of him was still living in the past.
I can't imagine how he wouldn't. Last question before I let you go. What would you like your grandkids who never met him to know about him? Succinct description of their great-grandfather.
He was fearless. He was fearful, but fearlessness outweighed fearfulness. And hope outweighed despair. And God outweighed the antithesis of God. That's what I would want them to know about him.
The Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation Holocaust Education Center podcast series. It has been a pleasure and incredibly emotional, but Michael LeRoy, thank you so much for telling your story.
Thank you, Elizabeth.